Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to the Ed Wood Summit podcast. I'm joined here again by the esteemed Joe Blevins. I'm really glad to have Joe here, always. And this is actually the third time this year we are going to do a book review for you folks. We're going to review another one of Ed Wood's books. One that actually has his name on the title, so there's no question. This is not, Wood that is questionable or surmised Wood. This is real deal Ed Wood, and as we get into it, very much so in every way imaginable. So well, first, before we get into the book, I want to say Joe Blevins is, of course, the founder of Ed Wood Wednesdays at his Dead to Rights blog, which is d2rights.blogspot.com. Tons of great cultural ephemera and pop cultural articles there. Tons, like literally, it's staggering almost how much is there. And Joe has also recently been really slogging away on a very noble project, which is the These Days Are Ours podcast with a partner of his, and chronicling each and every episode of Happy Days, the famed Happy Days sitcom.
Yeah, people ask why Happy Days, and I would say, why not?
Right.
It was a cultural landmark for like 10 years, and so many crazy and strange people worked on it. We just released an episode today where it guest starred a guy named Eddie Fontaine, the guy who sang Nothing Shaken But the Leaves on the Trees in the 1950s. Cool. And then Eddie had a crazy life as both an actor and a criminal. Who was charged with all sorts of horrible things. And I never would have known any of this story had I not looked into the history of Happy Days. So that's why you choose something like Happy Days. So
right.
In the case of this book that we're going to cover this week, this was my choice. It was your choice to cover the Watts books.
Right.
And then I just wanted to dive into the security risk book because I would say that among Ed's novels, it's kind of one of the more high profile books. Yeah. I think it's one of the better known books among that Ed has written. And it's about as close as he gets to sort of mainstream writing. And
for sure.
So that's why I kind of wanted to tackle it. And also in Andrei Prokowski's film, The Vampire's Tomb, which was based on an unproduced Ed Wood script, there's a character reading security risk in that film. And so I thought, boy, I got to jump in on this book. Well, you mentioned that Eddie's name is right on the cover here. And between us, we have covered so much of Ed's career, including a lot of ephemeral stuff, a lot of theoretical Ed Wood stuff. Yeah. And I was like, there's this huge mound of canonical Ed Wood stuff that we've never even touched. So That's why we're covering the novels now.
Absolutely. And it is so much fun to get back into the books. And I was glad. I said to Joe, all right, let's do another book review. You pick this time. And he came back with Security Risk. And I said, that's so kind of fortuitous. My birthday was in late March. And around a week or two prior to that, there was a copy of Security Risk up on eBay. Somebody in a private Ed Wood forum that we're involved in, Joe and myself and many other good guys, mostly guys. Interestingly enough, we're mostly middle-aged white guys, I think, us Ed Wood fans, oddly enough. But anyway, this Security Risk was up for $80, make an offer. So I said to the CFO, Kitten, my significant other, I said, because she's really good at these things, really good at these bargainings, because it also had the make an offer button is like bait in the water to her. So I thought, well, go ahead. You want a suggestion of something you can get me for my birthday? You could make, and I don't go buying a whole ton of the Ed Wood books because they would be way too expensive. It would be a sinkhole financially really, really quickly. But I thought $80 and she might be able to shave it down a little bit. So certainly I got it for my birthday. And I said, I'm curious, please tell me, just what did you ultimately land this for? And she goes, $55 shipping included. So she got a pretty significant chunk off. Yeah. So that is, one of the few Ed Wood, real deal Ed Wood. I have a handful now, probably 8 or 10, but
I have none. I only have reprints.
Security Risk.
Yeah. You notice what's on the cover of that book?
Yeah, a computer punch card.
And that ties right back to your last Ed Wood Summit podcast, which was about
Yes.
about Criswell, and Criswell was super into punch cards. And on his album, Criswell's album, which is a wonderful thing to get, he talks about punch cards a
Yep.
lot. And, you know, I worked at a research company for about 10 years in Chicago, and it was probably some of the last places on earth where there was still punch cards. That system was still in place. We were still doing some jobs through these punch cards, and there had to be special operators who knew how to operate those machines, you know, punch card operators. And I'm sure by now that's been completely phased out. So I got to see the twilight of the punch cards. But, you know, part of my fascination with this novel actually came from that same experience working at a market research company. Our division of the company actually worked on a lot of government studies.
Wow.
We worked on Department of Defense, Social Security, Veterans Administration. I spent hours of my life working on Veterans Administration jobs. And because we were working for government studies, we had to be behind a special second door that not even other people in the company had access to.
Right.
And we had to sign like non-disclosure agreements, and we had to go through security training that people didn't have to go through. And I promise you, nothing of interest was in any of those projects that we ever did. But because people couldn't get into our department, even people who worked for the company, every day I felt a little bit like Maxwell Smart going through the whole series of doors,
Right.
you know, that slammed behind him. And I can imagine Ed feeling the same way when he worked. We're going to talk about him working for Autonetics and making actual government training films
Right.
in the early 60s, and how I'm sure he had to sign some agreements and things like that. And I think it really, really went to his head, a lot of it. It's like making what sound like pretty benign training films. I looked at some of the titles here. Aviation Fuel Measurement System, Space Capsule in Flight, Radar, Chronometer, Sextant, Minuteman Missile Program. Well, that one sounds a little bit more spicy.
That's right. Not to cut you off, but that's right from one of his resumes. So everybody
Right.
knows that's Ed's actual list of films that he made for Autonetics.
And in this book, which is all about the making of government training films, he is like, you know, being in the government training film business is like being James Bond.
Right.
Basically, this is, now, would you agree that this is a James Bond inspired novel? Or do you think it's in the James Bond mold? Do you think
You
it's
know,
in?
that's interesting. I didn't necessarily connect that dot. I didn't, but it totally makes sense. It utterly and completely makes sense. Yeah.
Because, you know, his flirtations with every secretary he comes across
Right.
is
Right.
very much like his flirtations with Moneypenny. Every time he meets a woman, he's planning on how he's going to seduce this woman or have sex with her later. And there is a main villain in this book with the very unlikely name of Zarlof Rehnquisky, who
Yes.
seems very much like a Bond villain. He seems very much like a Blofeld or Goldfinger or one of
That's
these
good.
types.
That's really good.
And I just noticed now also, it looks like I'm recording my half of this podcast from a handball court or some sort of,
It
but
looks good. It looks good. I'm in a different setting for a change. I'm not in front of the pink curtain. So,
yeah, go ahead.
so Zarloff and Quisky, yeah, all that lines up, Joe, and it literally did not occur to me. No kind of James Bond connection occurred to me, and but that totally makes sense. Yes, he's portrayed as a very sort of rotund fellow, drives around in a big black limousine, and he's I couldn't make out. Well, we're getting
Yeah,
we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves.
Why don't you tell the listeners, why don't you tell our viewers, what is this book about in broad terms?
Security risk. So security risk is it takes place over the course of a mere 3 days or so on a weekend, and it's a small studio in Hollywood area, a small studio. I think Santa Monica. They mentioned
It
Santa
says
Monica.
Santa Monica Boulevard.
Right, a small studio. And that's actually relevant to something else, but there's so much to talk about on this one. It's going to actually go all over the map. I can see it. But small studio on Santa Monica Boulevard makes training films, government sponsored films, Defense Department films, things of that nature. So actually, the film that they're working on the set this particular Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday into a Monday. They're going to start shooting on a Monday, a film with on a rocket pad built in the studio. And the studio is described as quite elaborate, which, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. So the plot itself is there seems to be a lot of accidents happening around the studio, and people have gone accidents. Yes, people are dying horrible deaths, and the studio is experiencing one sort of unnatural disaster after the other.
Right.
So a former colonel who served during the Korean War named Harvey Tate, he happens to be in the film industry. He's in New York when the book starts. But his old friend from the Korean War, who is now a military guy named Ty Peters, who's on the case because this is a government training facility, a government filmmaking facility, whatever it is. He's on the case trying to investigate it, and he wants to call in his old buddy Harvey Tate, who is flies to LA and then starts immediately investigating what's going on here on the set at the studio's never named, right?
They say something like it's Lazar Studios at one
Right,
point. That's all
right.
they call it, is after the owner, Joe Lazar, but they
Joe
don't really
Lazar.
give it a name other than
Yeah,
that, other than Lazar Studios.
right. So,
Normally they just call it, go ahead.
well, so subsequently, Harvey is, you know, digging deep to try and investigate what's going on here at the studio. And there's speculation initially that there's this outside organization. Could this be where Zarloff Rehnquisky comes from? First, we hear communists. Later, we hear, again, it's hard not to get ahead of yourself on this one. Later, we hear that there's, they have white supremacist leanings. So, uh, in
Yeah.
in any case, Harvey meets a number of people, including Sergeant Tim Weir of I think the LA Police Department. And Tim Weir early on tells him, I'm going to shadow you all the way, Harvey, to make sure you're safe and protected, which he doesn't. He doesn't hardly at all, as a matter
No.
of fact. But he also meets Karen Faber, who's a Hollywood star, who happens to, out of a sense of, at least as she portrays it early on, out of a sense of patriotism, she participates in making government sponsored training films, Defense Department films, and things like that. They're classified, of course, which goes back to what Joe was talking about earlier. Moving into the facility, you'd meet a man at the gate, Charlie Brott, who was formerly an actor, as it turns out. Charlie Brott will stop you at the gate if you don't have the right clearance, and you need a G2 clearance, which is a Defense Department
Right.
clearance. Still exists today. And matter of fact, if you have a G2 clearance, it basically means more than likely you probably are part of some sort of Defense Department personnel, probably maybe working for a government contractor. And yeah, you'll have to report into them periodically and fill out the requisite forms. I read on a G2 site last night, if you leave the country, you have to inform them of it, things of that nature. So yeah, so this is the Lazar Pictures is kind of got that G2 clearance going on. And Harvey Tate moves in and immediately takes a lot of control of the situation, and really almost stunningly takes control of the situation, and manages, in fact, to resolve. I was going to say resolve it in the space of about 3 days, but does he resolve it? Right. So that's a basic outline of the plot. Is there anything you wanted to add to that, Joe? That's very sketchy plot
That
outline.
that is about what happens in this book. The chaos certainly does not stop once once Harvey gets to Hollywood. The deaths just keep coming, because the commies, or whomever they might be, including high school dropouts and college agitators, and
Right.
this whole coterie of unsavory types, they will stop at nothing to prevent the making of these government training films. And this story is kicked into action by the death of a script girl.
Yeah.
With a ridiculous name. She is named Yvonne Grape.
Yes.
And what I would say about this book is it's one of Ed's more coherent plots, actually. I mean, as far as long-term, as far as long-form fiction goes,
Yeah,
Ed actually kind of sticks to the story
he does.
more than he normally does. And yet, where he will go off is in his adventures, Harvey will encounter people, security guards, secretaries, fire chiefs, you know, whomever. And suddenly we're getting like a paragraph about these people. We're getting flashbacks to their life
Right,
and all this detail.
right.
And you're like, come on, Ed, get back to the story, get back to it. And you mentioned the security guard, Charlie Brott. And I had to, I read this book twice, I think, for the purposes of researching this. And I had to psych myself into being interested in Charlie Brott, because every time we would stop to talk to Charlie Brott, I would be like, come on, Harvey, get into that office. There's other stuff that you got to do. There's probably a pretty secretary that you're going to want to seduce in there. There's a bunch of, boy, a sexual harassment in the workplace is off the charts in this book, I'm telling you.
Mm.
But,
And drinking in the workplace
and
also.
drinking.
Yeah.
These are the drinkingest, smokingest, screwingest people I have ever known. But Ed will get bogged down with these characters, and he gives them all like ridiculous names. There's a couple of government workers who get killed basically off screen, and he calls one
Harmon is one, right?
Harmon. Well, Harmon's the main. Harmon is the original bad guy,
Yeah.
and Harmon gets like killed right away.
Yeah.
But one of the government guys who gets killed is named Kenmore Chauncey.
Kenmore Chauncey, yes.
And I was like, Kenmore Chauncey, like, does Kenmore Chauncey figure in the book? No. Kenmore Chauncey is killed off screen. It's just like a plot point. But Ed gives him this ridiculous name. And that's what security risk is like. I think Ed might have been a little bit, I don't know if he was more sober than usual, but he was a little bit more coherent than usual when he was writing this book. But every once in a while, he'll let some other strange character get in. And one of my favorite minor little characters was Peabody, because he shares the name of
Mr. Peabody. He actually introduces himself as.
Yes, Mr. Peabody, just like the cartoon dog from Rocky and Bullwinkle.
Right.
And Mr. Peabody is the manager of the Hotel Gidget in Palm Springs.
Yes.
And there's no Hotel Gidget in Palm Springs, but where Ed got the name Hotel Gidget, other than Gidget, the surf bunny, I guess is what he's naming it. But
I thought of it too.
That's how you know.
I immediately thought of the same thing, Mr. Peabody and Sherman. But when he introduces himself, I'm Mr. Peabody, and then we know Harvey Tate, Colonel Harvey Tate, by this point reasonably well, and Harvey Tate is going to have a smart ass sort of comeback, and Harvey Tate looks him up and down, and he says, "So." That was his response when Mr. Peabody introduces himself. But yes, we're at the. This is much further on the Hotel Gidget. This is how I knew this was going to jump all over.
Well, this is a crazy book. But you know, the thing that I noticed structurally about this book is that we have basically our trio of do-gooders in this book. We have a main cop. We have like a military guy. There's a military guy. What was the one who lives? I think is General Clayton.
Right.
Because we haven't discussed the fate of Ty yet, unfortunately,
Ty Peters,
or
right.
Ty. But we also have an ex-military guy in Harvey Tate. So we have cop, military, and ex-military. And I was like, oh,
Yeah.
that's the same threesome that is in Plan 9 from Outer Space. Those are the three guys in Plan 9. So those are Ed's heroes, the cops and the military.
I thought the same thing, Joe. So I thought the same, and I also thought, yeah, how they possess the same sort of viewpoints on the world and the same sort of value systems. They have a sense, a desire for imposing order on a world that has gone crazy, has gone haywire, and it has gone haywire. So let's jump back a little bit. Let's try to jump back.
Let's get back to Ty, maybe.
Let's go back even a little further. Let's go back to Yvonne Grape, all the way to chapter 1. So if you don't mind. So Yvonne Grape, the script girl, she smuggles the script for the screenplay out of the studio and goes out to have a drink after work. And she gets picked up by a guy who pretends as if he knows her, and she seems to believe it. And he pretends as if he's an actor. And she's about to leave, and he says, "No, come with me." And eventually, there's no choice in the matter. Takes Yvonne Grape, abducts her in the limo, and they go up to Griffith Park. They drive up into the hills, and they drive up to a cliff overlooking Griffith Park. And it's a disturbing scene, actually, and it's right in chapter 1. We're only 5 or 6 pages in. We don't know much of anything at this point from a narrative sense, and all of a sudden it hits us with a scene of her being raped. And then very quickly, and it's something that happens actually in the subtitles for the loops, where it's the girl says, the female says at first, "Oh, it hurts," and then immediately thereafter acquiesces. And it's the male rape fantasy at its worst, and it happens immediately in chapter 1, 5 or 6 pages in. We're in Yvonne's head, and she's narrating this from the first person at this point. She said, at that point, I realized I might as well just give into it and actually try to enjoy it. And she actually gets to the point of climax, and right at the moment of climax, she's stabbed and thrown over the cliff. And it's well described. In fact, I don't want to read a whole
No,
bunch
go
of
ahead.
bits and stuff, but this is really, again, to your point earlier, Joe, you said this is a pretty straightforward, more mainstream type of novel. This is very much a pulp novel in every way imaginable, and I
Oh,
think
yeah.
a good one at that, not to get too far ahead. But so she is thrown over, and the very last line of chapter 1 is, "The darkness closed in with the gurgle of lost sounds as she felt herself being thrown over the cliff." So that's the first character we're introduced to, and she's raped and killed, and that sets the stage for what happens next.
Yeah, it was almost like Ed was looking ahead to a movie of security risk, and he wants kind of a very arresting sequence to start this thing out. Because
Yeah.
if you watch The Sinister Urge, it starts with a woman in peril being chased, and that's the
In
very first thing that happens
Griffith Park, in Griffith Park,
in Griffith Park.
in Griffith
A-
Park, yeah.
And we get a really lush description of Griffith Park,
Yeah.
including a totally out of nowhere reference to Daniel Boone, the spirit of Daniel Boone. I don't know what that comes from, but I was interested in how Yvonne's body is discovered.
Yes, so we
I
get
thought was
chapter 2. So the Boy Scouts are out and about around Griffith Park, and a Boy Scout falls into a ravine and breaks his leg. It's interesting. He gets into a great deal of description about the Boy Scouts at this point, and about how well trained they are and how ready they are for incidents like this. And the kid's fine at this point. He knows how to adapt and deal with having fallen into a ravine and broken his leg. But then he leans back and he leans onto the bloated body of Yvonne Grape. And then it says, but he wasn't prepared for this. His Boy Scout training did not, of course it didn't, right? Finding a dead body.
and did you notice the name of that Boy Scout?
I forget.
Billy Talbot.
Billy Talbot.
Like a Lyle Talbot, I thought was named probably in honor
Interesting.
of Lyle Talbot.
Yeah,
So
that makes sense.
yeah, so Billy Talbot finds her, and this is, I don't know why this stuck out to me, but it was like the Coen brothers often in their movies will have kids stumble upon something horrible, like a kid stumbles upon a dead body in the street, or a kid finds a dead body in the water. And I was like, oh, this is like a Coen brothers scene where a Boy Scout finds the corpse of Yvonne Grape. But you mentioned the graphic rape scene. There isn't anything like that in the rest of the book that I know of. I don't think there. I mean, the rest is much more, drinking martinis and flirting with secretaries.
There's
And
very little sex in the book, actually. There's very little sex
yeah,
in the book. In fact, I think maybe I'm wrong here. Maybe I can't remember. I don't want to get too far ahead, but does Harvey have a interlude with the secretary later? He has an interlude with Karen Faber earlier on,
he
but that's
does.
really the only sex scene. So there's this rape scene, there's that. Then one of the subsequent sex scenes is Joe Lazar having a S&M scene with a wannabe starlet. And that goes badly because the black sedan, the black limo, and Zarloff Rehnquisky and the boys show up, and they drive him back up to the cliffs. And so that's congruent, actually, with these people getting thrown over the cliff.
Yeah, and that's as Ed Woodish as the book gets, is, well, in a couple of ways, because one of Ed's favorite themes, mentioned the Sinister Urge, but it's also in Hollywood Rat Race and some of the stories, the short stories that he wrote. It's always about young, naive actresses coming to Hollywood,
Yep.
and then they wind up having to have sex with with casting agents and producers and directors, and that happens in all of that happens in a lot of Eddie's stories. And I think there's at least two in this. There's two stories like that. There's one girl who has to have sex with a guy who says he's going to make like a recording of her voice, like he's going to make a sound recording. So he takes her into a soundproof booth and have sex with her. And then this poor girl, Jenny Cardy from Indiana, is the girl who has to have sex with Joe Lazar.
Is she the one somebody's described again? It's coming crashing together in my mind, but very much as with Angie in Watts, the difference in Watts After, and it's a common trope. The girl arrives in Hollywood because she's won a contest.
That's the other thing. I had never heard of all these contests until Ed's stories, but apparently half the women in Hollywood are there because they won a contest.
Right.
And you've read the Criswell songwriting book, the Tin Pan Alley book, and half that book is about like you're entering your songs in contests, and then the contest coordinator shepherds you around town. I was like, where were all these contests happening? Well, I guess now, we have these reality competition shows where you're supposed to, where you supposedly get some break in show business. But apparently there's a lot of these shady contests. And the thing is, in Hollywood Rat Race, the people who the old guys who are sleeping with the young starlets, he calls them Mr. Sleazy, But in this book, I think we're supposed to like Joe Lazar.
Oh, I think so too. I think actually when he's first introduced, second chapter, as a matter of fact, because they immediately go talk to him about Yvonne Grape, and he's a little arm's length, I think, at that point, and he's a little bit hard to get to know in the original sort of introduction for him, but he continues to recur throughout the book, and I think he does become a very fun, sort of sympathetic character, and Harvey trusts him. Ultimately, he trusts him fairly early on. He comes to trust him. That will become obviously a linchpin for the narrative, who to trust, which, real quick, the back cover, it has nothing to do with the book, but the back cover of Security Risks has, in quotes, "If a man can't be bought with money, get him a woman." So that's the back cover of Security Risks, the front cover. And the book has no collateral. Just to get into this really, really super quick, no collateral whatsoever. It starts on page 1, it ends on the last page printed all the way through, and there's just the text. But that back cover has obviously nothing to do with the book. It's not about, what does it even say? If a man can't be bought with money, get him a woman. That Harvey Tate obviously is really genuine. I feel that he's genuinely imbued with a desire to get to the bottom of it. It's a sense of patriotism for him. Does he like some of the sideline activity along the way? Yeah. Is he a guy who likes a little bit of danger? Yeah. Does he drink heavily? He drinks as heavily as everybody else in the book. Yeah.
Yeah. You said that this book takes place over a course of just a few days. They're extremely busy days. And yet Harvey is always planning his next romantic rendezvous. There's a couple of different secretaries at the studio that he has romantic designs on, including one who ends up being the sort of the damsel in distress, sort
the girl
of at the
Friday.
end.
I think the girl Friday. Yeah.
And she turns out to be, even though she's introduced way late in the book, she turns out to be a pretty major character. And then there's another secretary who doesn't get a name, but you'd figure, he just saw, well, we haven't gotten to Ty yet, but he has just seen his best friend who just summoned him Los Angeles, gunned down right in front of him. And it practically isn't more than a few pages before he's like, well, how am I going to get laid now? You know, like, where's my next
Well, I,
drink coming from? And where's my next girlfriend coming from?
I think probably you may very well have thought the same as I, Joe, but a little bit later. So what happens next? Let's get back a little bit into the
Yes.
chronology of events here. So after Yvonne Grape is killed, then Harvey is called in by Ty Peters, and he's put on the case. He goes to the studio initially. He talks to Joe Lazar. He's starting to try to figure out who are these bad guys who are attacking the studio and killing people around the studio, people affiliated with the studio. And then rather shockingly and suddenly, I think it's Harmon. We said Harmon, one of the hippies, right, is the guy who shoots
Right.
Ty Peters. All of a sudden, right, all of a sudden it happens as they're, I think, driving out of the studio gates or something like that. Harvey, for the first, he hasn't touched a gun in years apparently, but all of a sudden he I think it's described as he literally blows Harmon's head off immediately. But Ty Peters
Yes.
nonetheless is dead. So you said best friend, because a little bit later he reflects back on that. He goes, my best friend was killed, and it's important to me that his wife is given the information. And so you did think what I was thinking. I could see it now.
Yeah.
But what was curious to me was earlier in the book, he's like, Ty, I haven't seen you since we were in Korea together. We haven't. So is that your best friend when you haven't seen your best friend in literally 15 years, give or take? So I don't know. So maybe I question that. But I really thought at that point, because then you tell me what happens next, Joe, when he talks about we need to inform Ty's wife of what happened to him.
Well, there's some character that you always have to have in every work by Ed Wood, and this is the book's designated Shirley. Yep. Shirley is the poor widow of Ty Peters, and I wanted a scene with her. Me too. We don't get one, but you're like, oh.
I actually thought for a moment, right at that moment, actually, it sprang into my mind the notion that Harvey was somehow going to have a relationship with Shirley. I really thought that.
Well, he might still, he might, it's always that scene in military movies, war movies, car pulls up in front of the widow's house, and the guy in the military uniform very somberly walks up to the front door. Well, who's to say in Ed Wood's world that couldn't lead to something a little romantic on the side? He shows up with the bad news, but then he's like, want to go get a drink or something, and then it becomes a whole date. So yeah, we don't get it. We don't get a scene with Shirley, but he wants to be the one to tell Shirley that poor Ty is dead. And what's interesting to me is that they keep calling Harvey Colonel through this whole book. He's often called Colonel more than he's even called Harvey or Tate. And I wondered about that because he's not active duty military anymore. Right. So why are they still calling him Colonel?
Well, I think out of respect, I think they start calling him Colonel, and he announces himself as such. And again, there's a sort of a nomenclature amongst all these people who are operating in this world, with the police, with the government training facilities, where they would respect the sort of gravitas of him having been a colonel. That's how I took it.
Yeah.
It is odd, but who is it that refers to him as mother?
I don't remember that. Does he ever get called mother?
Very early on in the book, one of the people that he meets, I believe.
Okay. There is this great quote near the beginning. Let me see if I can find, because I wrote this.
It might be Tim Weir. It might be Tim Weir.
Because when they have their first dialogue, he says, "You machine gun happy pollywog," and I was like, that is some Ed Wood dialogue right there. But they eventually, like, one of the other minor characters also turns out to be somebody that they in Korea. So another character from their Korean War experience turns up. And I guess this shows you how, times have changed because Ed had to move on to the Korean War because maybe it wasn't plausible to have World War II people
Right.
anymore as the military guys. So he had to move on to Korea.
Yeah, a little younger audience buying the books. Those World War
So
II vets might have already been a little bit getting
yeah.
into their 60s, 50s, 60s. So Tim Weir, Tom Weir, he's introduced as
Well,
Sergeant Tom Weir.
you should explain that.
So
You
Tom,
should.
so early on, he meets when Harvey gets into town. He meets with Sergeant Tom Weir. He's mentioned as Tom for maybe a page or two, and then he disappears for maybe a chapter or so. And then when he comes back, they have a long conversation. And now he's Tim Weir, and he tells Harvey they connect. Harvey seems to trust him, and no reason not to. Tim Weir ultimately ends up being a trustworthy character in the book. Many others you can't say the same for. So Tim Weir goes into, and this is what you talked about, Joe, where people get into their backstory and they get into their belief systems and they get into their value systems and they get into their political understanding of the world at large. And Tim Weir goes on for literally a couple of pages early on in his first conversation with Harvey, and Weir, the name, when I saw it, because yeah, there are odd names throughout the book. Yvonne Grape, Zarloff Renkwiski, even Harvey Tate is just a very straightforward sort of pulpy name. Tim Weir, spelled Wiere. At first, I was kind of like, that's a little bit of a more typical human sort of normal name, right? And then it dawned on me only this afternoon because of an article that Joe had written on the Dead to Rights blog, that one of Ed's favorite shows was a sitcom from 1962. Was it called Oh Them Bells, I think?
Oh, those bells.
Oh Those
Yeah.
Bells, which the Bell brothers were the characters in the show, but they were played by the Weir brothers. The real guys were the Weir brothers, spelled the same way. So I think that was a little bit of a nod to that. You also mentioned, Joe,
Yeah.
we're still only in chapter 2 or 3 land at this point. Joe Lazar, when he's introduced, the name struck a chord with you.
Yeah, I thought he was named after Swifty Lazar, who was a very famous Hollywood deal maker and talent agent. And I thought, oh, that's kind of Eddie's nod to old school show business, was knowing the name Swifty Lazar. So we have Joe Lazar. And if you see pictures of Joe Lazar, he looks like a Drew Friedman drawing come to life. He's like the oldest, wrinkliest guy in the world because maybe all the pictures of him were taken, near the end of his life. So I've never seen a picture of Swifty Lazar where he didn't look like a million years old.
That's cool.
And Eddie even specifies during the S&M scene with Joe Lazar, his ancient buttocks, I believe is the phrase. Which was more than I needed. But yeah, this book is really full of references to old-timey Hollywood. Old-timey Hollywood is, of course, one of the things that Eddie is passionate about, and it contains all these references to it. There's a reference to D.W. Griffith and Birth of a Nation.
Yeah.
And way later in the book, when Harvey Tate is in a shootout, he steals a trick from an old Buck Jones movie. And of course, Buck was Ed Wood's hero. And Jean Clark, the second secretary who becomes the Girl Friday, she steals a trick from a Boston Blackie movie. And so Ed gets to work all these, it's 1967. It's like summer of love. It's
sure.
hippie times, but Ed's mind is back several decades. He's thinking of
several, right? Literally, he's
many
like,
decades.
I mean, you go back to Buck Jones, right? I mean,
well, he goes back further than that. We go back to sort of the dawn of movies because we get to hear about the first picture maybe ever made, and that's a Joe Lazar anecdote that we get. It doesn't anything to the story other than color, but we get to find out about Joe Lazar making a biblical epic on Long Island.
Yeah.
This was back when the center of movies was. This was back when the center of the movie industry was New York. before it went to Hollywood, New York, and Eddie flashes back to that. And we hear about how the security guard was one of the apostles in a Last Supper scene. And Joe Lazar, remember why he's so disappointed is because all this food and all these props and just for 13 lousy actors. And, that he said, and so it reminded me, it reminded me of that it reminded me of the Monty Python sketch where where Leonardo da Vinci is painting the Last Supper, and he's disappointed that there's only one Christ and 12 disciples. So he adds all these extras in, and then there's 3 Christs, and there's a mariachi band and a juggler and all these things. So I was thinking maybe that was the kind of movie that Joe Lazar wanted to make, a busier Last Supper. And he wasn't satisfied with the original draft of the Last Supper. He wanted to rewrite it. But yeah, lots of old Hollywood in this book.
Right. The Buck Jones moment took my breath away, actually, when all of a sudden out of the blue, and I think he capitalizes Buck's name for no other reason than to capitalize his name, Buck Jones, right? All of a sudden, a reference to Buck Jones. So I guess it's a common ploy that Buck Jones's character, or a character played by Buck Jones, must have done, which is to kind of throw something and because then they'll hear it land, and then they're going to train their gunfire on it. And then you'll know where they are. They're going to reveal themselves. Yeah. So it made me think. I watched a lot of Hong Kong gangster movies throughout my adult life, and I really like John Woo gangster movies. So that's something that I think it happens in The Killer with Chow Yun-fat, but instead of just throwing an object, takes a big round of bullets and throws it. So the guys, when they train on it and shoot it, they basically explode it and kill themselves, which is a more advanced version of what Buck Jones was apparently doing. But yeah, so there's Buck Jones. Yeah. There's D.W. Griffith you mentioned. I think it was Intolerance. It could have been perhaps Birth of a Nation or both.
I wrote down Birth of a Nation, so I must have seen Birth of a Nation in there somewhere.
Yeah, but I'm thinking scenes for both were shot in Griffith Park.
Right.
So again, we're going to get stuck in chapter 1 if we
well, let's move on.
So super quick though, the Yvonne Grape is killed. There's been a ton of people killed. You could do a little research on this. There's been sadly tons and tons of people killed in Griffith Park through the years. It's almost got a reputation for that, which isn't all that surprising. I mean, given its geography, and I think it's the largest public park in the United States in terms of geography. But one last thing about Griffith Park. So you can sleep in the park. Which is what Ed says. You mentioned Joe Hollywood Rat Race. You can go ahead and sleep in the park. So that idea struck me, and I thought, well, and I did a little Googling, and then I came across there was a gentleman, I think his name was John Farrell, in the late 1950s and early 60s, who spent 5 years living in Griffith Park as a sort of a vagrant. So I'm certain wasn't the only one. So but it made the papers, like syndicated nationally across the whole entire country. So you would think Ed may very well have known about that. That has very little to do with security risk. So I go too far afield. So Joe.
Yes.
Go ahead. Take it back on track before I go away.
Well, okay. So Yvonne Grape's been killed. Ty recruits Harvey to take over. Harvey watches his friend Ty get gunned down, but Harvey goes on with the investigation, more determined than ever to get to the bottom of the sabotage that's happening. He meets this actress, Karen Faber, who is a big Hollywood star, or apparently an up-and-coming Hollywood star. They flirt, very much like James Bond and every Bond girl you ever met. And what happens is that Karen Faber wants to get out of town for a while. She wants to go out to Palm Springs. And Harvey follows her out to Palm Springs. And so the next phase of the book there's more sabotage and murders in and around the studio. But the next phase of the book actually it takes place out in Palm Springs, which was interesting to me because as a kid, my family took a bus tour around California and Nevada. And Palm Springs was one of the places where we went for a day or two. And I just remember it being very beautiful and having wonderful weather, and wishing we could stay there forever. So Palm Springs is a very nice place. And it should be a Garden of Eden for our hero and supposed heroine, we think, at this point, Karen Faber. Uh, but uh, things don't go the way that Harvey had planned. Um, One thing is, through Karen Faber, Ed is able to introduce the other most famous fetish of his, other than the name Shirley, which is that Karen has a real fondness for Angora.
A crazy
And
fondness. In fact,
and not just that, not just to wear it, but she has a divan uh, in Palm Springs, just covered in white fur.
yes.
And when Harvey visits her bungalow at the Hotel Gidget, the first thing he notices when he gets in there is that furry couch. His eyes go immediately to that furry couch. And I don't think Harvey would have noticed. I think Ed would have noticed. I think Eddie would have noticed that couch. I don't think Harvey would have given 2.5 times about that couch. But, and of course, all this time, they're just tossing down drink after drink after drink. I mean, you would be dead of alcohol
I
poisoning
know, right?
if you drank like the characters in this book. But I
My
mean,
God.
but just like James Bond, there's an incident that happens at the Hotel Gidget when he is getting a message. Well, he's getting a message that I believe is it that one of the saboteurs is dead. Is that the message that he gets? Because he gets some kind of message from the police.
Right. It's like one of the hotel employees is there
Employees,
giving a
and
message.
is summoning him back. He's being summoned back to Hollywood because there's more deaths happening in the case, and of course he has to investigate. But before that can happen, he gets, or perhaps Karen gets, a dagger thrown right at them. And you know where that dagger was made? Communist China. That's where
China.
it was made. It's a Chinese communist dagger.
China.
Like you couldn't make a dagger in the United States. You would have to, commies
Or-
would have to use,
or-
would have,
I mean, if you had a knife that was made in China, would that really indicate that it has to be communists? Right?
Yeah,
Is
well,
that
it has to
really?
be.
Is that a?
well, so you'd think they would be panicked, but instead, I mean, they go about their day pretty leisurely. They still have time for a drink. There's time for Karen Faber to strip. And in her stripping,
Yes.
what seemed to me to just be a throwaway detail actually turns out to be like one of the things that ties this whole story together.
It's the final sort of punchline.
It is the final
Again,
punchline of the novel.
we're getting
which
again.
we're not, but what really impressed me is that he puts Karen on a plane back to Hollywood, and he drives back.
Yeah.
And this is where, I hate to say it about Ed, but if Security Risk had been made into a real movie, I don't know that Ed would have had the chops to pull off the sequence that happens next. I think in the hand of a really skilled action director, for me, this was like the most exciting part. Then what comes up next is one of the most exciting parts of the whole book. And I don't think Ed would have had the chops quite as a filmmaker to handle this. But Harvey is driving a souped up sort of convertible. I don't know if they ever give us the make and model, but it's a convertible. And the bad guys are driving a limousine, which are known for being high performance vehicles with great gas mileage, and really a lot of get up and go in those big black limousines. But apparently this one has some kind of, I don't know. Again, I got to say James Bond, Spectre, or or whatever the name of the organization is in that one, has put some kind of souped up motor into this limousine. And then what follows is, I thought, a really competently written and, in fact, quite exciting chase sequence through the dark. And this is all taking place on what they call the San Bernardino Freeway.
Yeah.
And I found out what this is. It's called Interstate 10, or in California lingo, the 10. So there's this recurring sketch on Saturday Night Live called The Californians. It's a soap opera set out in California, and the characters are like, oh, they really speak with like the really heavy California accent. And one of the running jokes is that they're always talking about street directions. Well, you get on Ventura and you take it to, that's half of what they talk about is street directions. And from those sketches, I learned about the 10, because they're always saying, so you get on the 10. And so the 10 is what they're talking. But Eddie doesn't call it the 10, because maybe people didn't call it the 10 back then. They call it the San Bernardino Freeway.
Yeah.
And I got to be honest, even though I did go to Palm Springs as a child, I don't know what the road in Los Angeles and Palm Springs is like. I do know that it's pretty much a straight shot east. If you start in Los Angeles, you just go straight east, you'll get to just go straight east on the 10, you get to Palm Springs. Well, now he's coming back, and he's going through different little communities that I've never heard of, like one called Banning. And I'm trying to follow the
Beaumont. He goes through
Beaumont,
which made me think of Beaumont. Could that be anywhere? He was at the end of World War II. Beaumont
right.
was where he was stationed.
So he's going through these communities that I didn't know. So I don't know if it's populated out there. And again, this is the 1960s. Maybe it was much less populated, but there, and there really wasn't a heck of a lot happening between Palm Springs and Los Angeles.
Right.
I do remember from being on those buses that when you're traveling around in California, there'll be and then there'll be miles and miles of nothing, and then there's another city. There's, it's a lot of desert out there. So that's what I assume this place to be when when the big black limousine is bearing down on him, shooting at him. And I didn't really even understand all the maneuvering that he does. Hides behind a truck at one point, and then he goes off the road and hides behind mesquite bushes. But
he drives into the oncoming lane to force the other person off. Yeah.
That was the coolest.
Not deliberately to force. He knows but that was it's either me or them, and I think they'll be the one who go off the road, not me. Yeah.
That was the coolest part, was that he takes a chance that the other person is going to get out of his way. Right. And I was like, well, this is going to need whoever directed Vanishing Point or Bullet or something. Right. They need that guy. I mean, I don't know that Ed's going to be able to do it, because
I thought of Mad Max and Road Warrior. I literally thought like Australian
movies.
George Miller
could have directed. Yeah. George Miller could direct this, but Ed, if you've seen his attempts at car crashes or car chases, he can't really do it. So, not that he would never be technically capable of it. I just don't think he would have the resources to do it. But right. That was, to me, I don't know why, but that was my favorite part of the book, was this this very exciting chase scene through the desert on the highway at night. And I kind of even forgot that I'm reading this for Ed Wood. That I just get into it as an actual action scene. Right. And like, wow, this is pretty cool stuff.
I thought about that, Joe. I thought you could take this book and you could slap somebody else's name on it and hand it to somebody. And if except for literally, with rare exception, like there are tip-offs if you know Ed Wood well, but this could pass for a pulp book written by just about any reasonably competent pulp writer.
Yeah.
Which is that high praise? Well, I'm not sure that's high praise.
Here was the thing, I was saying, like, when we covered the Watts books, if somebody wanted a book about the Watts riots and they got Eddie's books, I don't know what the hell they'd make out of it. They'd be
Right.
like, what is this? But if you're like a reader of men's adventure magazines, men's action magazines, if you're a reader of Playboy magazine and you read the stories in there, and you pick up a copy of Security Risk to read on the train as you're going into the city to be a stockbroker, whatever it is that you're doing in the city, and this is the thing that you're reading, I think you got your money's worth out of this. Like, I think this is going to work for you as um, a bit of pulp fiction. This is a manly book for manly men. This is a book for, it's about square-jawed, very heroic guys. And it's for people who either think of themselves like that or wish they were like that. And I think if you are a person like that, this book is going to check all your boxes, because there's pretty dames, there's gunplay, there's commies being shot all the time. One thing that I like is that Eddie is not afraid to kill off people on both sides. Good guys and bad guys are getting killed kind of pretty regularly. It's very rare that there is a chapter that goes by where somebody doesn't die. And in Zarloff Rehnquisky, which is some kind of name, you really do get a Blofeld type, or and it ultimately does lead up to what you want in every James Bond movie, which is the scene where Bond and the main bad guy face off and they engage in repartee, like they are they both think of themselves as being very sophisticated and very witty. And I don't know that Ed is able to pull off that kind of James Bondian kind of wit, but he makes an attempt at it. And you do get that, it isn't like they never meet and Zarloff is just killed off screen or something. You finally, you do ultimately get that big, you get that confrontation between them. But that black car that I mentioned becomes a problem, because I think it's the same black car that they eventually send over the cliff. Once they get rid of it, and it turns out to have been from Joe Lazar's studio.
Yeah.
So when Joe is killed off, now this was something that did annoy me throughout the whole book. I guess the cops are just being cautious here or something, but every single time somebody dies, there's like, gee, could this be part of it? Could this be part of it? Oh, I don't know.
Right.
It could just be a coincidence. I'm like, what are you talking about? Everybody from the studio is
Right.
dying.
The
And you,
studio's been bombed with TNT and dynamite. There's been electrical accidents that are clearly not accidents happening. Like it's
yeah, gee willikers, could this be part of it?
Yeah.
Gosh, I don't know. And that they're always really hesitant to say that this is part of the conspiracy, or this is part of the sabotage. Of course it is. Of course it is. Of course it is. But they are very, very slow to admit that. But when it turns out that and this is just a sidelight. Last week in Edward Wednesdays, I covered the unmade film Hellborn.
Yeah.
And some of the footage that was shot for Hellborn wound up in Sinister Urge, and some of it wound up in Night of the Ghouls. One of the things that Eddie shot was a car going over a cliff and then crashing into a tree. And then you see a dead person like hanging out the window. And that must have been an image that Ed really of a car crashing, because he puts that into this book as well. And I guess you could arguably say that he puts a big car crash into Orgy of the Dead as well. That's another thing that must have been another image that really popped into Ed's mind, was this image of cars going off cliffs and crashing into trees.
Right.
But when Joe, this sympathetic, lecherous but sympathetic old Hollywood guy, dies, the bad guy set it up so that I think he's still awake alert to some extent in the car as it's going down the cliff. And there's a really prolonged and kind of horrific description of Joe's death as the car is crashing and Joe's kind of being torn all apart. And what interested me was that when the first I ever heard of this book was, of course, in Nightmare of Ecstasy. And that's the thing that Rudolph Gray chose to include, is this horrible description of Joe Lazar's death. So I'm not sure why he chose that rather than a scene of, let's say, Harvey Tate flirting or Harvey Tate being cool and shooting somebody. I know he chooses the horrific death of Joe Lazar.
Interesting. I haven't looked at I don't read Nightmare of Ecstasy anywhere near as much as you might think I do. I kind of almost avoid it to a degree because it's the staging ground for so much of what we know about Ed, and I avoid it to a degree. I think it's absolutely an important book, and I know Rudy Gray actually reasonably well, so maybe I'll ask him that question. I don't know. He might be surprised by that question. There's so much going on in the book, though, Joe. So we haven't gotten into a couple of things yet.
Go ahead. I mean,
we need to backtrack just a little bit to Karen Faber, and we need to get a little bit more into her Angora fetish. And then we need to also kind of put the brakes on a little bit, because there's so much. We're at a point where we're talking about things that have happened throughout the whole entire book.
Right.
But there's still a long way to go in terms of the narrative, to a degree. There's many other characters and stuff like that. So I want to, if it's cool with you, Joe, I just want to take a quick five. I want to take a quick five. And take a pause, and then we're going to come right back. And first things first, I want to get into you'll understand where I want to go. We want to talk about fuchsia Angora, which is the
fuchsia Angora. Yes,
fuchsia Angora. So we'll be right back.
All right.
All right, thanks everybody. We took a quick break, catch our breath, and now we're going to jump right back into it. So I wanted to jump back a little bit to Karen Faber and Angora. So she is associated with Angora in every time she appears, from the first appearance in the book throughout. First thing we get is a description of the Angora outfit that she's wearing, and they're quite elaborate at times. The Angora outfits that she's wearing, including, and it's the first time I've seen blue Angora, I've seen pink Angora, I've seen lots of yellow Angora, different colors of Angora, but she wears a little bit later on in the book, at one point, fuchsia Angora, which was rather stunning. So by this point, her and Harvey have a rather sort of witty repartee, and they seem to have the relationship, to a degree, reminded me a little bit of the relationship between Rocky Alley and Angie in Watts, the pair of Watts books, where they seem to have a really adult sort of sexual relationship. Fairly mature adult sexual relationship, and it takes a little bit of a southerly turn.
It does. I've read a couple of books, read a couple of reviews of this book where they say that Karen tips her hand maybe a little too early in the book by constantly talking about what she's doing for her country. She's always saying my country this and my country that. I will be honest, I'm not good at guessing plot twists. I'm almost never a person who says, like, oh, I saw that coming a million miles away, or something like that. I didn't really, I went into security risk knowing as little as possible. I try to go into these books knowing, when the first time I read them, knowing as little as possible about them. And I didn't see any real red flags with Karen Faber the first time I read through this book. Maybe the second time I read through it, maybe once you know how she turns out. But I just saw her as your typical Bond girl, as your Ursula Andress of the book here, But I guess in the Bond films, sometimes the girls turned out to be, true blue to the end, and sometimes they end up betraying Bond. And I didn't necessarily see her as somebody who was going to betray Harvey but I agree that they do have a very boozy and smoky adult relationship, and it seems to be one of very mutual attraction. And you know, we know about Harvey's priorities right away in the book, because there are two things in this world that Harvey says he cannot resist, and that is, one is whiskey, and two is a pretty broad with a swinging ass. So
There you go.
those are, it's right down to the basics. So
What
yeah,
guy? What guy reading the book would go, "Oh yeah, that's me too," right?
exactly.
Right. Right. So, so Karen, of course, turns out to, it's clear. Needless to say, we haven't stated this explicitly, but spoiler alert, an hour into it, right? A spoiler alert. We're obviously going to tell you everything that's really happening. So if you're going to plan on reading the book and you don't want to know what's happened ahead of time, don't watch this podcast. But realistically, there's so much happening here that you could watch this and still read the book and still probably pick up all kinds of other little strains and threads of oddities that we haven't even picked up at this point. So so Karen, so if you go back to, let's go back to the Gidget Hotel real quick.
Yeah,
And at the Gidget Hotel, there's an attempt made on Harvey's life. Somebody throws a knife and it nearly hits Karen. So at this point in the book, we don't have a whole lot of reason. Although the foreshadowing you mentioned, Joe, is
right.
interesting. I kind of thought it's a bit much the way she overstates it early on, how she wants to do for her country.
Well,
But I didn't think it was going to go that way. That's not what I thought was going to happen, because what ultimately happens is, as you can quite obviously imagine, we're jumping ahead a little bit. Karen is part of this shadowy organization, these commies or borderline white supremacists or whatever they are, and but at
maggots,
maggots, germs,
lice,
germs.
germs.
Yes, we get those descriptions. But at the Gidget Hotel during this scene, Harvey's very protective of the idea. I don't want her to think that they're out to get her, but I think they might be after her equally as much as me. But now, in retrospect, when you get to the end of the book, you look back on that scene and you say, well, she knew all along. So this was all staged. This was
Yeah.
all really entirely staged. Now, the thing that's puzzling, Karen could have taken Harvey out at any point along the way up until
Oh,
that point if
easily.
she really wanted to, right?
Hey, if she had been like a Sharon Stone and Basic Instinct type, all she would have to do is reach under the mattress. There's an ice pick under there, you know, kaboom. She's obviously, drinkers like that, they got to have ice picks around, and kaboom right into, the carotid artery or something, and he's done.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I guess Harvey's thinking is that these commies are so intent on taking down every aspect of the government training film business that they
Yeah.
will follow one of the actresses out, to Palm Springs to take her out, to prevent her from being in one of these films. I think one of the, what we haven't talked about with Karen, is one of the real red flags, which was that she did not become famous here in America like a
Yes.
decent
Well,
actress should. She became famous in that den of iniquity and vice known as Europe. And, that ain't right. She
well,
becomes famous over in these European pictures.
and she's
That's
not,
pretty shady.
it's even worse, Joe. She's not even Karen Faber, right?
Right.
She's not the real Karen Faber. So the organization has transplanted her into the personhood of the real Karen Faber. What did I don't know even what to make of it now that I'm reflecting back
Well,
on it. She went to Europe, the real Karen Faber, and had some fledgling career, perhaps starting to gel. So I guess they would have had to have taken out the real Karen Faber, right? I
yes, I
assume
guess they
so,
did, because
right?
they say near the end of the book, Harvey says, well, you didn't show any mercy to the real Karen Faber. And I wondered about this. Okay, they didn't get Karen Faber's real hair color right. They didn't
Yeah.
get her real eye color right. And what did the real Karen Faber, not have any relatives, not have any friends, not have anybody who knew her in America who would recognize when she got back, hey, Karen,
It's a
your
different
eye and
person.
hair, yeah, you are a different person, apparently. So, this is classic spy stuff, the
Yeah.
person who looks exactly like the other person and the old switcheroo. I don't know that ever happens in real life, but it happens in spy stuff. Like even when, Fred Flintstone did a spy movie, The Man Called Flintstone, and the whole plot of that movie revolves around Fred Flintstone having a look-alike. So, and there's like a spy who looks exactly like Fred Flintstone. So, this look-alike thing is in the espionage genre, even if it never happens in real life. Um, I'm sure there have been examples where people have been, replaced with lookalikes. There's always conspiracy theories about political leaders who are ill and then
Yeah.
replaced with
Right.
lookalikes and things. But in this case, they took out some minor actress just because well, Harvey thinks they're taking her out because they're trying to get rid of her because, she had the audacity to appear in these government training films. Now, you sent me an article about uh, Autonetics, the real company that Eddie worked for in real life, and um, one of the things that's mentioned in that. One of the things that's mentioned in that article is that they were trying to instill in their employees how important this work is that they're doing.
Yeah.
And this is a speech that comes up. I think this is a point that's made in the novel too, about, some people may not think that what we're doing is so important, but believe me, this is really vital, vital work that we're doing. The thing where I was let down by the government here is, okay, Lazar's studio is getting sabotaged left, right, sideways,
Daily,
up, down.
daily, multiple times a day. Right. Yeah.
Send some troops over. Send somebody. Send the National Guard. Send somebody out to protect this place. Like, can't you even protect this tiny studio? You can't send anybody. The film processing lab gets. We didn't even talk about that. The film
Burned
processing
to the
lab
ground. Yep.
gets ground, and that's where I'm talking about, where Ed puts in all these characters. Ed like spends a paragraph talking about this Chief John Dressler,
Oh, he
and I'm
goes
like,
on. He goes on
on and on about
for
Chief
about
John
two
Dressler's,
pages. Yeah.
and I was like, well, does Chief John Dressler figure in the rest of the book? He does not.
No.
But we have to know, well, when Chief John Dressler is barking orders, it's not because he's a stern man. He has we go on and on about his temperament, and I was like, okay,
I think you're onto a very characteristic Ed trope, Joe, which is introduce a character and get you a little bit interested in this character. So this fire chief has all these political views on things, and he's got this sort of real strong arm sort of sensibility when he's on the job, because he knows that when we have to put out a fire, there's no nonsense, but I'm really a compassionate guy. So we're getting this reasonably, in the space of a couple of pages, reasonably well-rounded viewpoint on a character that utterly and completely disappears right after that.
yeah.
Always. It happens throughout this book, actually. Characters come and go just after we're starting to perhaps become a bit interested in them.
Yeah, I counted, there's something like 25 named characters in a novel that is not particularly long,
Right.
um, and which is more than you would expect there to be in a book like this. So yeah, Eddie just can't resist adding in all these characters. And I think I've always said that one of Eddie's biggest influences must have been Jack Webb. And because when I first read this book, I didn't even know Harvey Tate was coming up. So that's how little I knew going in. I didn't know Harvey Tate was coming up. I was reading about Tim Weir and his sidekick, Luke Hemingway. And I was thinking, oh, okay, this is going to be a dragnet thing where these two cops are investigating, and this is another police procedural. And it kind of is a police procedural, but then it's also a police procedural, and also there's this movie making
Right.
colonel who comes in, and also there's another guy who comes in, and there's a fire chief, and there's other cops and stuff like that. So
So that's Tim Weir's younger partner, Luke Hemingway.
Luke
I
Hemingway.
forgot. Is it Karen, or is it one of the other? There's only a couple of other girls that appear very fleetingly. Karen's, of course, the main female protagonist by far. Uh, I think it's the first time Karen appears where Luke Hemingway's there, and he introduces himself as I'm Luke Hemingway, and she goes, "Do you write?"
Yeah, that was cute.
Yeah.
That was well, we also get like many mentions of this third cop, Detective Sergeant Hart O'Neill, who is on his honeymoon,
Yeah.
not part of this story. He's Sir not appearing in this picture, and yet every few chapters we get to some reference to Hart O'Neill.
That's so
And
good. That's so good you mentioned. I felt early on, Joe, like they were setting this guy up to look like he was going to become some sort of turncoat or bad guy, and then he just utterly and completely disappears.
here's
Yeah.
he's just yet another sort of red herring. Uh, yeah, well, I'm thinking of these things. If this had been made into a movie, uh,
Yeah.
the character of Zarloff Renkwiski,
Okay.
for a second, even though he has hair and a goatee, I think he's described as, I was thinking that Eddie was writing this part for Tor Johnson. I was thinking that
Oh wow.
this huge foreign man was going to be a part that Eddie was thinking of for Tor. But Zarloff talks too much, so I don't I don't know that Tor could have been able to do it, but that's what I was thinking of when I know like Duke Moore would have gotten one of these cop parts. Duke Moore would have come in.
Like General Clayton or something like
Yeah,
that. Yeah.
Kenny Duncan would have come in on this.
Yeah.
He might have brought in Johnny Carpenter, people like that, to play these sort of bland functionaries. I have no idea who would. I have no idea who would have played Harvey Tate.
Did you think immediately when you first read it, you think Joe Lazar is introduced as the guy who is the film producer at this government training studio or government film studio, and you think maybe is Ed imbuing a little bit of himself into Joe Lazar? And I thought that at first, but then I realized he's really getting in behind Harvey. Harvey's a filmmaker, and he likes the idea of him being a smooth ladies man and being quick with the gun. And did you notice also the first time they give Harvey his credentials? They've already got it all prepared before he even arrives by plane. They're ready for this, and they give him all his credentials that he's going to need to. Pretty much, it gives him like superpowers to a degree, but they give him his gun, and it's a 38. Every time subsequently through the rest of the book, it's a 45.
Yes.
Yeah, it's just little things like that are very Ed-like, right?
Yeah, and he kind of makes a big deal of the caliber of the gun. He makes a point of pointing it out. So I also noticed that when they get off when he gets off the plane, the first thing Harvey and Ty do is go to a bar, and they comment, "Oh, they sure do make these bars convenient to get to, don't they? They make it so convenient to get to." Nobody ever gets drunk in this book.
No, no.
So, but the other thing I was thinking of was there's this law in mystery books, in mystery novels and mystery movies called the law of economy of characters, where if a character is getting a lot of is getting some lines and getting some mentions, but is not seeming to play any obvious role in the book, that character is going to have some secret function, is going to have some function down the road. And the only one to whom that applies, I thought, in the book was Belinsky, the night guard. We mainly talk about the day guard in this book, Charlie Brott.
Yeah.
But then there's occasional mentions of a night guard named Belinsky, and then Belinsky turns out to be working with the bad guys, and Belinsky, I think, gets killed near the end. But One major incident that we haven't really talked that much about is Martin Feiler,
Yeah, Martin Feiler.
who is an electrician. He's working on the rocket ship set, and what I think happens, it's difficult for me to understand what's actually happening here. I
He's
think
throwing electrical lines
yes,
at Harvey. Yeah.
and I just pictured that the live wire just sort of spitting sparks in all directions, sort of like a serpent or something. And of course, he's fired right away, and but not before Harvey gets to rough him up a little bit.
Yeah.
And and poor Martin, he must have had a twinge of conscience or a change of heart or something, because he was going to go to the cops, and they get him before he goes to the cops. The cops are so dumb in this book. They're like, gee, could this have been part of it? He
Right.
died like 2 blocks from the police station and he just was working at that. Wow, what a great coincidence this is. Like, they think this whole thing is like this series of coincidences. And all the time, thank God Harvey was there, because Harvey is always the one telling them, no, this is part of the case. This was all part of the plan.
Right.
Like, he's the one keeping him on task. So,
So realistically, the bad guys do have a whole bunch of plants, right? Not only Martin
yeah,
Feiler, but Karen Faber.
yeah.
They're tailing Harvey as soon as he
Mm-hmm.
lands in LA. They're immediately tailing him.
They are
Like
well organized.
they are really on top of it. So it begs the question. It felt to me like I'm reading it and I'm reading it and I'm like very satisfied. I'm very satisfied by all this narrative development. And it's very pulpy and everything that we talked about. And then as I'm getting a little bit deeper into it, I see it all of a sudden seem like it comes crashing to this halt. Like, and I felt like this begs for a sequel. It begs for a sequel, right?
Well, I wondered if he had planned a series of
I
books
thought
about
so.
Harvey. I think that was probably in the planning. I don't know if Security Risk sold well. It always seems to be the one. It seems to be one of those books that is findable online. Not that I've ever bought a copy of it myself. I don't own like a real copy like you own a real copy, but it at least seems to be findable. It seems to be there's some Ed Wood novels that have kind of been completely forgotten or never turn up, and you almost never see copies of them. But Security Risk seems like one of the more available ones. So I think it probably sold maybe fairly well. We didn't even talk about that. Who published this darn thing?
Pad Library.
Pad
So,
Library.
so it's Pad Library, same as with the Watts pair of books, same as with quite a few other ed books. 66 through 68 or so is kind of the. I've actually, it's a long work in progress, but I've been very slowly trying to put together a Pad Library index. And at first I thought there was hundreds and hundreds of Pad Library books, and then I thought, nah, there's not quite as many as I thought there were. And Hal Cantor. Uh, just last night, I cracked open a book that I had gotten recently, and it had on the cover the name Ron Davis. It was a Pad Library book, and I said, Ron Davis, that sounds totally like a pseudonym. Davis might be Ed-like. And so I go on these fishing expeditions, obviously. And then I opened it up, and on the cover page, it said, by Hal Kent, which is Hal Cantor,
Right.
which is a different writer who wrote for not only Pad, but also ended up writing for Pendulum, even on the TK Peter series a couple of years later. He wrote the adult version of Dracula by Calga, which
That's where I know that name
yeah,
from.
people
There
think
we
Ed
go.
wrote that. Ed didn't write that. He wrote the adult version of Frankenstein. So anyway, Pad Library is very fascinating to me. But I also grabbed a book, Joe.
Sure.
I got a whole bunch of books in the mail in the last couple of weeks, and my budget is blown. But I got some Pad Library books, and one of them, I won't say the name right now because I got a lot of work to do to vet this. But as I got a little bit deeper into it, I'm like, this really sounds like an Ed book. This really sounds totally like an Ed book. But the thing was, when I first bought it, I didn't think it was a Pad Library book. I bought it because I saw the index page on like the eBay listing said Selma Street a Selma address. And I thought it's somewhere in like North or West Hollywood. It's just some little fly-by-night publisher.
Right.
And so Pad Library typically has an address out of Agora, California. Agora. This is a, and then I realized when I got it, it has a Pad Library index number on it, which is actually kind of close to the Pad Library index number on this book that we're talking about right now, Security Risk. And that was odd, a different address being inside the page. But there's so much work to do, right? I mean, just going,
Well,
I don't even want to go off on that tangent, but the
well,
possibility of how much work Ed was involved in is, to me, staggering at this point.
well, I wonder, was a book like Security Risk, was this being sold at just regular bookstores? Were did you have to bookstores to buy this?
I think
Um,
adult bookstores only, I really think,
yeah,
which
because
limited it a great deal.
I would say that in terms of explicitness, this is way less explicit than Ed can be.
Yeah.
Um, again, he is largely focused for the women characters. He's largely focused on breasts, or bobbies, as he calls them. He's always talking about what's under their sweaters. And well, that's the other thing that goes all through this book, is that there is not a female character who appears who does not have her outfit described in detail. He knows what color it is. He knows what fabric it is. He can tell you that, you know, she's wearing silk or satin or orlan or marabou or angora. He will know what fabric. I don't think he'll ever describe a guy's outfit unless they're wearing like a
Never,
military, he doesn't care
never.
what the guys are wearing at all.
No, you're right. Never,
Um,
never. Right.
well, he'll do it for foreshadowing, and this is how you know, like, one character is bad news, because you see a youth wearing a wrinkled shirt
Oh
and
yeah.
Levi's, and I was like, oh, Levi's, that's not good. In
That
Eddie's world, wearing Levi's, that's
that goes back to Harmon and his cohort. You mentioned the name earlier, that crazy name. So Harmon is a hippie, right? A hippie guy. So it goes back to, actually, it reminded me of the Watts pair of books where the organization was sort of trying to stoke things up on a college campus.
yeah.
So here's this organization now sort of bringing these sort of like hippie guys from around the strip. I don't think it happens here in Security Risk, but it seems like it happens over and over again. It's something I probably just read in the last day or two related to Ed, but it's like you can't tell the girls from the boys anymore. And that's that
Well,
thought. These kind of hippie guys who are now the bad guys who are getting sucked into this communist conspiracy.
well, for Ed, for this era of his career, he goes light on that stuff in this book, because I don't think he even mentions the Sunset Strip. He
Mm-mm.
doesn't really dwell on guys with long hair. He doesn't really talk about hippies or beatniks or anything. He doesn't dwell on it the way he does in the Watts novels. So, and I think that's to the book's benefit, because it, I mean, obviously it's of its time, it's of the 60s, but it isn't as tied into like 1967 as it otherwise could have been.
Right.
He goes light on the anti-counterculture stuff. Um,
I think when he talks about Harmon, he talks about how on the college campuses, there's this kind of dialogue going on. A very brief mention to your point. It's not dwelled upon,
right.
but it's there. It's a connection to
Yeah.
something that elsewhere is explored a great deal.
Well, in other books, he'll just, even if it has nothing to do with the rest of the plot, he'll just put in a paragraph about you can't tell the boys from the girls on the Sunset Strip anymore. And he'll just put in a whole paragraph about that stuff, even if it doesn't have anything to do with anything. He'll just have his characters maybe just reminiscing or looking out over Los Angeles and pondering what's become of this city. I guess that's part of the fun of this book, is that Harvey Tate is not a Los Angelino. He is an outsider, and even has to have somebody draw him a map out to Palm Springs. And so it's not about how Los Angeles has changed or anything like that, other than, well, the location where Joe Lazar's body is dumped is, and this was pure Ed to me, was an old Western movie filming site, like one of those old Western movie ranches. And I think Ed loves those places. I think he's fascinated with those places. I think,
Oh,
I'm
sure.
not sure if any on his own attempts at making Westerns, if he ever got to shoot on one of those movie ranches.
Well, I would
I'm
think.
sure people,
Sorry, I would think he shot at Corriganville, right? Tom
right.
Corrigan's place, Crash Corrigan. I would think he shot there. I actually Corriganville was utilized as the Spawn Ranch set for
Yeah.
Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
I was just thinking of Spawn as I was talking. I was thinking,
Yeah,
um, it's amazing that Eddie never wrote a book about Manson or inspired by Manson and Spawn, because boy, a bunch of killer hippies on a
yeah,
Western movie set, like that's everything that's all of Ed's boxes. If Charlie drank a lot and wore Angora sweaters, it would be, his,
yeah,
it would be his, no, I don't know. He wouldn't give the Angora fetish to a bad guy, I guess. Although,
maybe.
well, and here, Karen
Right,
is the
right.
bad girl. But all through this book, I mean, he will stop whatever he's doing to talk about what the ladies are wearing. And more than anything, one thing that runs through this book is panties, pink panties, lacy panties, panties. Uh, that's one
Well,
of,
it's the
and
it's the pink panty thing that sets up the final sort of the climax of the book. So
oh,
the first time that Harvey has an interlude with Karen Faber, she leaves her underthings on, and afterwards, it's described as immediately afterwards she takes them off. And then when she takes off her pink panties, he realizes this is terrible, right? This is
yes,
terrible where this is going. He realize it gets into sophomoric jokes at this point, right?
yeah,
He realizes that oh wow, she really is a blonde when she takes her pink panties off, and
yeah,
that becomes Gene Clark's sort of point of contention on
yeah.
the very last couple paragraphs of the book.
Paragraphs. She says,
He
"How
says,
did you know
"Why do
she
you
was?"
know, right? Why did you know that she
Well,
was a blonde?"
now speaking of the evidence that incriminates Karen Faber, one is her blonde hair, but the other, I found this a little implausible. Um, is the matchbook from the
Oh yeah,
hotel Gidget, and
I
I,
I was like, wait a minute. The guys in the sedan were following them at the Gidget. Why could they have not been the ones who had the matchbook?
matchbook.
Why does he immediately connect the matchbook, the existence of the matchbook on the cliff where Joe Lazar died? This is the details we're talking about. Why does he immediately say it had to have been Karen? It had to have been, and it
Well,
turns out it was, but why? Like it
well,
doesn't make rational sense.
well, the other thing is that the matches don't work anymore because
Yeah,
they
they're
were
damp.
left out.
Yeah.
But the way he gets that matchbook is that the cops give it to him. Like the cops who were investigating a crime scene, they found a matchbook and they were like, "Hey, free matchbook." And they were like, "Come on, guys, you put that in like a little plastic baggie and you send it down to the lab, you dust it for fingerprints or whatever. You don't just say like, duh, here's a matchbook that we found at the crime scene. Hey, you want a knife? We found this here,
Yeah,
get a
right.
knife thrown at you. Hey, free knife." I mean, I couldn't believe how dumb the cops were because, well, he's talking to the cops at that crime scene. He looks at two of them and he says, "Oh, I can see that one is the Sherlock Holmes and the other is Watson." And I was like, "No, neither one of those guys are Sherlock Holmes. None of them are even Watson. They are
Beautiful.
two dummies." The cops in this book are just so dumb. And so
And well, my feeling as I got through that latter part of the book, I was like, why did it wrap up so quick? Why did he connect the dots to the matchbook that quickly? And now Karen's revealed, and now Jean Clark, who kind of interesting, even though she's been very minutely referenced earlier, she really does become the Girl Friday, and she becomes so interesting. I really felt like I want to know more about them. Like
Well,
I really do want a sequel to Security Risk.
well, yeah, they don't set up Jean until the very end of the book, but then, she's like a big part of the she's a big part of the action climax of this book.
There she says, "I know all the lines of every film we've ever shot
Oh
here at the
yeah, that was
studio."
the other
Yeah,
that was the
right.
other thing. Even towards the end, um, Karen Faber says, "I've won. You see, even if you arrest me, you won't be able to make your precious government training film because who will you get to star in it?"
Yep.
So I was thinking that Ed wouldn't have bothered to set up this character of Jean Clark and make her such an important sidekick to Harvey if he wasn't planning on doing another book with them. I was
Right.
thinking like he's definitely setting up Jean to be the sidekick the
Right.
next book.
You
But
have to say what's going to happen Monday morning, because the whole book is driving towards Monday morning at the studio. We're going to start shooting
right,
again. We're going to spend the next 3 days refurbish all crews are going to work 24/7 to refurbish the studio. They're going to work all weekend long because we got to get the government training films back up and running. So Monday morning we're going to shoot again. We don't actually get there, but
oh,
everything leads up to that point, which is why it's so pregnant with like what's going to happen next, right?
well, I think you know when I saw that. How do you know she's a real blonde thing? I didn't look down to the bottom of the page and see that that was the end, but I was thinking like, oh, that's a punchline, and I think Eddie got to that point and said like, oh wait a minute, that's a punchline, that's like a button, like I'm ending this book, boom, period on a sentence,
Right,
I'm done. That was like a mic drop, and then you walk away because
right.
he came up with what he thinks is like a genius ending. And but yeah, he never did write a second thing as far as I don't think he ever wrote a second thing about
No,
Harvey.
not that I know
But
of. No.
um I
So
wonder, yeah, go ahead.
no, I was gonna say no. Go ahead. You were
I
gonna.
just wondered, like, if Harvey is such a big shot film producer, um, what is he doing out in New York? I mean, is there that much film production out there? I don't
We
know. New
we
York is
never
very
we find out. Actually, that's a good point because we find out no details whatsoever
about what he
about
does.
Harvey's film
Maybe
career.
television. I mean, but even by even by the late 60s, I'm pretty sure by the late 60s, the center of the universe had moved, the center
Yeah,
of the movie and television universe had moved from New York to um, to Hollywood. And
maybe,
I
maybe.
wonder, there's obviously still television production, talk shows and things like that are being done, game
Maybe
shows.
maybe he could have been producing soap operas like The Young Marrieds, the spinoff from General Hospital in
Maybe
1966. Maybe. I don't
I was
know.
wondering,
Right.
when did when did one of the most famous moves out west, other than the Brooklyn Dodgers becoming the LA Dodgers, was Johnny Carson taking the Tonight Show from New York to Los Angeles.
Yeah.
That was a big deal because Johnny was kind of one of the center figures of television, and if he's moving across the country, that really shows you something. That shows you
Yeah.
like, I watch a lot of old game shows and stuff, and I've written about What's My Line on my blog. And What's My Line in the 60s was being done in New York, but I'm sure by the 1970s it
Oh
was
yeah.
being done in Hollywood. I'm sure it was being shot out in Hollywood.
Well, Criswell would have never showed up as on the Tonight Show if not for Johnny moving to Hollywood,
Right.
right?
So but that's why you move out to Hollywood. It's because that's where everybody is. That's where all the actors are and stuff like that.
You
I
take a bus, or you win a
yeah,
contest, or you take
or
a
you win a
bus.
contest.
Yeah.
Well, and I am kind of nostalgic for the days when Hollywood was centered in New York, and I think maybe Ed was maybe a little nostalgic for that too, the days, because he goes back, like I said, he talks about the olden days in New York. Um, Another game show, just a brief game show anecdote on What's My Line. One of the questions, one of the standard questions for the celebrity guests, if they're trying to guess a celebrity, was, are you playing in a show that's currently in New York? Have you ever been on a stage in New York? And so they asked that of one of the mystery celebrities, and then they asked a clarification question. What do you mean by New York? And Dorothy Kilgallen said, Manhattan. And I was like, okay, so this is by New York. They don't even just mean New York City. They mean Manhattan. And so that was where, to them on the old What's My Line, Manhattan was the center of the universe. But although that's not where that's not where Joe Lazar made his Bible pictures. It was on Long Island.
Long Island, which is interesting. Yeah.
But clearly, but so I just wondered what Harvey was actually doing out in New York. Uh, I can imagine him. I guess, is he going to take over Lazar Studios now? Joe's dead.
He's introduced very confidently as the person he is, and we're just immediately made to accept him as for who he is, right? There's
Yeah.
not a lot of detail. He's actually a bit of an opaque character. We don't find out any. We get no biographical details whatsoever about his previous relationships. Does he have kids? What happened to him? We don't know. We have no
Yeah, we
idea.
have no idea, other than he was in the Korean War
Yeah.
and must have achieved the rank of colonel and still takes a lot of pride in that, and was friends with Ty. But I guess after this, he's going to probably be installed as the new head of Lazar Studios, and probably is going to carry on making these government training films, and is going to be protecting those government training films, with a gun if he has to, and his wits and whatever else he has at his disposal, because
That's it.
that's where
That's
they're
it.
going to.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Well, because that's what I mean. The commies are never going to stop.
Right.
Well, the one stylistic thing that I like from this book, normally, and you can tell when Ed Wood is in a coherent mode, because all of the chapters of the book will be about even length. It'll
10 or
be
12 pages. Here we get a page. I saw the same thing. A page, 3
but then
pages. Yeah.
But then there's one chapter in this book, chapter 9. I'll remember it. And the only point of chapter 9 is to introduce Zarlof Rehnquist.
It's literally about 150 words, maybe.
Words.
Right.
It's like a couple of paragraphs. And I was like, oh, that's actually kind of a cool stylistic thing, because it makes you feel like, oh shit, like this guy is the guy. We've had good guys killed, bad guys killed, but this Zarlof guy, he's like the Anton Chigurh of security risk. Oh, speaking of, wait a minute, before I even say anything, did you know that there's a movie called Security Risk?
No, I didn't know.
It was made I was watching a little bit of it today. It was made in 1954. Stars John Ireland and Dorothy Malone.
Wow.
And it's about an FBI agent. He's on vacation at a ski lodge. And so it's a ski movie. And then but he begins to suspect that there's commies maybe following him and trying to sabotage some scientist. And so even though he's on vacation, he gets into, action mode.
Wow.
And that's John Ireland in Security Risk.
That sounds like very interesting, obviously.
Well, I was wondering if that was maybe in in the back of Eddie's mind if Eddie had actually seen Security Risk with John Ireland. And
well, think about this, Joe. I thought about this, like, who is the security risk? What does the title even mean, right?
I had a theory about that.
Okay.
I would say that this novel has a title character. I would say there is a person who is the security risk, and it's Karen.
I
I would
think
say
so too.
Karen
All right.
is the
Yeah.
security. And the thing is, she's Little Miss Blonde starlet, Hollywood sweetheart. She's the Meg Ryan of 1967, and everybody loves her. And that was Joe Lazar's fatal mistake. He trusted this blonde starlet to come in, and he gave her all like the details of what they're doing.
Yeah.
And then she was the security risk. So
Wow.
I think Karen, I think she is the or whatever her name might be, because it's obviously
Yeah.
not Karen. And there's a funny little scene. I didn't write down all the names, unfortunately, but Harvey asks her, like, what is it? Karen Tarkovsky, or, what's your real name?
Oh yeah, all these sort of Russian sounding last names, right? Yeah. So that's interesting. Meg Ryan, right? It's interesting you thought of that, because when I was a kid growing up, I was like, I had a crush on Meg Ryan. I thought, wow, Meg Ryan's great. I never thought of that way, but it makes sense, right?
Yeah,
Karen's
Karen
great.
Faber.
Even though, in the end, she's the Russian plant. I guess the Russian plant, right?
Yeah, I guess.
She's it doesn't seem like she's that invested in their mission.
Not really, no.
Right?
And I think her attraction to Harvey is genuine.
I do too.
I think
I do
she's
too.
like legit into Harvey. So yeah, I think she, well, she only becomes like a super badass like in like the last 5 minutes of this book. Like, she becomes kind of somebody completely other than herself in the last 5 minutes. She says, like, I forgot what she says, like, oh, you Americans, you always impressed me with your optimism or something. She then becomes, well, this book has kind of a dual climax structure. We get sort of a big showdown with Rehnquisky, and then he's killed. And then you think, oh, is the book over? No, the book's not over. Then there needs to be a big climax face-off showdown with Karen. And it ends up being Jean who saves the day, and with a brilliant little ploy where, and I thought, is Ed really going to go for this? Because Karen still has plans to escape, and her plan is that she is going to escape dressed as Jean, I believe, and then she orders Jean to take off her clothes. And I was like, oh, come on, don't make Jean, don't do this to us, Ed. Don't make Jean like strip and give her clothes over to Karen so that Jean ends up naked at the end of the book. I thought that would be a little too cheap. But Jean has a trick up her sleeve, and she like reaches into her purse, I guess, and grabs some like beauty powder or something, or some makeup or something, and she blows it. And she said she learned that from Boston Blackie, and I was like, what was Boston Blackie doing with makeup in his purse?
She said that, and then Harvey says, you need to tell the government authorities about this technique that you've got. Right, this technique of blowing powder in people's faces. So but she it seems like it could go a bad way at the end, but it ends up being very upbeat. Last line, that last couple of lines, of course.
Well,
how do you know she's really?
So it ends on a note of whimsy, I would say. It ends on like a little like a little inside joke and things like that. But those sort of winking endings are part and parcel of Bond. James Bond was doing those all the time. And I always wonder, if you ever watch old episodes of Star Trek, they'll often have like tragedies or something happen, characters die and whatever. But if it happens early enough in the episode, we can get to a final scene on the bridge where Kirk, Spock, and McCoy are still able to like banter and joke around. And I'm always hoping that they do. I'm always hoping that the tragedy in the episode was early enough, like the red shirts who beamed down to the alien planet and got killed, that's been long enough that we can finally get a final joke with Kirk, Spock, and McCoy at the end. So that's how you know it's been a happy week at on the Starship Enterprise. And it's the same way in this book. Like, I don't know, half the people that they know are dead. I mean, like everybody in their social and professional circle is dead now. Who's still alive to work on this rocket booster movie? But I was glad I looked at their resume and
Oh,
go ahead.
no, no, I'm sorry. You said rocket booster movie. So the thing that is perhaps most outstanding right now is Autonetics, right? So Ed is working for a company called Rocket Pictures. He calls it Rocket Studios on his resume, but I think it's actually Rocket Pictures because I found, listings for them, and they're not a studio that was engaged in making these government contract films. By 1959, Rocket Studios or Rocket Pictures, they're literally they're on Santa Monica. They're at 6108 Santa Monica, Rocket Pictures, and they're making almost entirely sales training films. Make your supervisor a better supervisor. How do you get your employees to be more engaged? All that kind of stuff that every company on planet Earth
Right.
is still trying to crack today, right?
Right.
But they had an arm of Rocket Pictures called the Better Selling Bureau. The Better Selling Bureau. So they did all these sales training films, all the typical horseshit, right? Typical horseshit, sales training, get to know your prospect and get to know their needs and discover their needs, and then blah blah blah. Well, you get it, right? So
Right.
so on Ed's resume, he says, I spent 27 months working at Autonetics on loan from Rocket Pictures. 27 months. So when does this exactly happen? It ties to the book Security Risk, obviously, because he's sort of setting it there. That's not the studio, Joe, right? It's not like a Hollywood studio with a big
No,
rocket ship set, right?
I think that what Ed is doing is a little bit, like I said, like what I was doing when I was doing government surveys. I think he was doing pretty boring work, but to keep himself engaged, I think he was maybe building it up. And I'm sure what he told people he was doing, or what he even told Kathy he was doing, was, I think, bigger than what he probably really was doing. Um, because we know, thanks to James Pontilillo, we know how Ed exaggerated his own record. We know that Ed's own war record is basically fictional. The real record and what Ed told people are not at all the same. And I think this Autonetics thing was another example of it. I think this training film phase of his career was something that he built up and up. And I think this was more of Ed mythologizing.
Yeah.
I think I think he's a dreamer, and I think he likes to feel like he's, in on the heroic stuff and the secret stuff, and whether he was or he wasn't. The article that you sent me about Autonetics um, was pretty prosaic stuff. One thing that it pointed out was that, which I still don't quite get what it is closed circuit broadcasts
Oh,
that were
yeah.
for the employees, because the article is about that, and supposedly Eddie worked on the closed circuit stuff
Yeah.
as well.
So on his resume, he talks about on his resume, he has all these little hashtags, literally hashtags on his resume. am I a director, a writer, a producer, a performer, or headliner? And so he'll aggregate more hashtags on his resume based on that. And the Autonetics period, he at one point, and there's two separate segments to the resume, right? He talks about being at Autonetics and making government-sponsored films, like about the Missile Man. So let's go back real quick. Autonetics is a company started in about 1946 or 1948, and government sponsored defense contractor who mostly made inertial navigation systems. So they made navigation systems for ballistic missiles, for undersea submarines, the Nautilus, which passed over into, I think, the North or South Pole in like 1959. There's a great film about that. He directed some of these shorts for Autonetics, but we don't know exactly what. And I have
Right.
never found one that I know exactly what it is. But he also mentions on his resume, his resume says closed television, I think, but
Yeah.
it's really closed circuit television. So if you look at that article about Autonetics, they actually very much pioneered bringing closed circuit television into the plant. So they had a plant in 1961, 62, around the time Ed
Right.
was there. They had 28,000 people working in a handful of plants around Southern California. In Downey, Anaheim had a huge plant. And they would broadcast live right to the employees, and
Right.
they would do it for like 15 minutes during break. They would do it at 8 to 9 o'clock every morning to get everybody ramped up to work. And they were doing it essentially to try to drive down the parts per defect, just like
Right.
very much like in today's world, what you would think of as sort of like Six Sigma, right? Like Six Sigma kind of stuff. And they got awards for it. The head of Autonetics got an award from June Allison in 1962 for
Hey.
the closed circuit television being used as a training tool in the plant. So you got up in the morning, you went to the plant, and next thing you know, there's closed circuit television. They're telling you about safety. They're telling they're telling you a bunch of different things. And so Ed's director, he has one hashtag on his resume next to that closed circuit television thing, which is director. So he's got a background through the 50s and working on television series. So he is directing that stuff at Autonetics, and they had 28,000 employees in 1961, 62. By later years, they had like 38,000 employees just at the Anaheim facility alone. So it's a huge, huge government contractor. And exactly what's Ed's role there, that sort of spells it out. It does.
Yeah.
Security risk obviously doesn't go there, but that's
Well, I
related.
was, yeah, I was glad to see that article because it at least explains. I mean, the resume doesn't explain much of anything. So when I saw the article and explained a little bit more what this closed circuit program was, then I was able to visualize it a little bit better in my mind. Um, because from the resume, I didn't get much of anything out of the resume other than the titles of the films and then that closed TV line. And then in the article, it explains a little bit more of what this program was and what it was used for, and why at the time, I guess this was considered very innovative, um, which it doesn't seem like it would be innovative today,
Right.
but I guess by early 60s standards, it was innovative. Um, but I still think that, Ed, this wasn't like I don't think it was very exciting work. Maybe I don't think maybe this phase of his career was the most exciting, but I think he wanted to build it up into something, and
Yeah.
I think he took these experiences like he would take anything in his life and embroider on it. And I
Yeah.
think you know. Well, you might be at any job and start thinking, oh, what if there were sexy dames and bottles of booze in every desk drawer, and there was
Yeah.
gunplay, and you know, you can imagine Ed wanting to be wanting his life to be more like this. But and it always strikes me that Kathy Wood was a very trusting person who probably just took a lot of what, who took some of what Eddie said at face value, you know. And so when she talks about it in Nightmare of Ecstasy, she says, oh, it was very confidential and Ed had to sign all these agreements. And I think maybe Ed kind of even talked it up to Kathy a little bit.
Yeah.
And, you know, and might have been also an excuse not to tell her what he did at work that day. You know, he would come home
Right.
and just want to drink or something and sit down and like, oh, I can't talk about it. It's this, you know, this high level government thing. You know, you wouldn't understand it anyway. This is secret stuff here. So, um,
I think I wonder during that time frame, does he really feel like he's doing something that's surreptitious? Does he need to go underground? And then
a
I wonder,
little.
more importantly, I wonder, how does he lose the gig, right? Like, how does
Well, yeah,
that had to have been for him, it had to have been a really good gig, right? At that point in his life.
yeah, yeah. But who knows? You know, maybe he couldn't keep sober during those times. You
Yeah.
know, you never know. Maybe he was not reliable,
Yeah.
um, or he became unreliable. Um, I wonder how he got the gig in the first place. I mean, how did he
Right.
get recommended to make this stuff? I guess because he had experience in television. Um, you know, Eddie's experience making television shows is really a really under documented phase of his career because he has on his resume all these local television productions that he supposedly
Yeah.
directed, I guess at KTLA. And, you know, there's this whole slate of um, made for TV movies basically that he was said to have directed, and nothing about those has ever turned up.
Yeah.
Um, the one that I want to see most of all is the little old lady from Pasadena. I was like, what is the little old lady from Pasadena? Um,
I want to
but
see San Diego Harbor. San Diego Harbor.
San Diego Harbor is another
Yeah.
one. But, you know, Eddie is supposed to have done Los Angeles television, and very little has turned up. I think there's been rumors that he worked on Dig You Later Vampira, which I don't know if that's ever been confirmed or anything. I think that might be a lot of nonsense. I think that might be a lot
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
smoke and mirrors. And we want him to have worked on the Criswell Predicts show. I don't know
Right.
that he did.
Right.
Um, Rudolph Gray suggests that he worked on a show called Thrills in Sports. I can't find any
Me either.
articles
Yeah.
about thrills in sports. So Eddie's TV career is a real, it's a real gray area. It's a real like you know, it's a real vacuum in his career. So
Sure.
I don't know if he did what he did. I'm sure he did some, because stuff like uh, you know, the sun was setting and stuff
Yeah.
that exists. I mean, that seemed to have been for television. I don't know exactly why he did that. Um, I know he filmed it at a television studio, and it seems that seems to for the time too good to have been just thrown into the trash. I'm sure that if he filmed it for a because you know, I've been writing about the Tom Keane westerns, you know,
Yeah.
and more of those keep turning up, and there's even more that are supposedly in the vaults and still existent. And I was like, those are too good to have just been tossed out. You know, those actually did air somewhere,
Right.
and they did. And it turns out that they did air. They didn't just throw them into the garbage and that was it. Those actually aired somewhere. I'm sure that Crossroad Avenger must have aired somewhere. They got some mileage out of it. But maybe those jobs got him the Autonetics gig. And I would guess that he lost that gig the way he
Well,
loses anything.
I think it's important to mention that on the resume, he talks about well, he doesn't talk about it. He says on the resume, he is on loan from Rocket Pictures. So I think that's important. So again, I really Rocket Pictures, I mentioned this earlier, is a little obscure uh, company that's really into sales training films and film strips around 1959, 1960. But they have they're called Rocket Pictures, and
Great
I
name.
I can't remember. I'll put a image up about a Rocket Pictures ad from 1959 so you could see it. But they talk about being the missile of the film industry or something like that. They don't make films about missiles and about
Right.
defense contracting sort of related items. So I think maybe North American Aviation, Autonetics, I think maybe they thought, well, Rocket Pictures apparently makes movies about, because they were hiring a whole bunch of little, I've seen it, they were hiring a whole bunch of little companies to make sponsored films for them. And
Right.
so could they have hired Rocket Pictures? And so here's Ed Wood. This is pure speculation, and I'm going way overboard. Uh, 1959, Ed's working for Rocket Pictures. They're doing film strips and sales training films. He's writing lots of ad copy. I will actually share a couple pieces of that with you to tell you why I think that. And somehow along the way, uh, North American Aviation slash Autonetics goes, wow, Rocket Pictures might be able to help us make movies about the Missile Man rocket and about inertial navigation systems and about the Nautilus traveling into the South Pole and things like that. I don't know. I don't know. It's really a crazy subject to get into.
What is all this stuff, if it ever was truly classified, is it still?
Right.
I can't possibly be. I mean, this technology is
Right.
6 decades old. So, I mean, by now this stuff must all be in the,
Oh yeah, it's old hat.
but I don't know if, I mean, Autonetics, as far as I know, was absorbed by Boeing, I
Boeing.
think.
Yeah, by
So
Boeing.
does Boeing keep records? I don't know. Who knows? Boeing has
I don't
problems
know.
of its own. So I wonder if Boeing kept any of this stuff, if somewhere in the in a vault or in a warehouse, like at the end of Indiana Jones, there's
Yeah.
some there's some a crate full of Eddie's films. Maybe they did. Who knows? Um, so I would love to see it. Although I think my suspicion is going to be that these movies are, if even if they were ever seen, are extremely boring. I
Right.
think that
Right.
these are going to be extremely dull films. I'm thinking back to during the space race, some NASA training films had become sort of public domain, and some enterprising TV producer thought, I'll make a cartoon show out of this. I'll have this show where these two kids who want to learn about science watch these NASA training films, or these, and it is the most boring show I've ever seen in my life. It was called The Big World of Little Adam, and the animation is terrible. It's very limited animation, and there's like a couple of minutes, there's like a few seconds rather, of Adam and his brother like finding out about some topic about how missiles work or how spaceships work or something, and then they'll cut to the NASA training film and they'll narrate it. The kids will narrate it in their own voice. And it is the driest stuff I have ever seen. So the only way that it would have been interesting is to a kid in the 1960s where anything space related was
Right.
interesting.
Right. I've
So,
I've seen a handful, literally only a handful of Autonetics sponsored films from like the late 60s, late 50s rather, early 60s, and none that line up with the titles on Ed's resume. But you're right, they're very dry, they're extremely boring. It's kind of like ho hum.
so the thing that I wondered was, from reading Security Risk, did you feel that the inside details that we were given about the making of the rocket booster movie, did that feel like it was written by somebody who had actually been on such a set and would have known? Did that sound like it was written by an insider, or
I
was
felt
that?
I felt like he was just taking it way over the top. Like, no,
Well,
that studio doesn't exist. Like they went and they shot real documentary footage on like battleships and on the deck of a battleship, and they shot in different military facilities. Like it didn't ring true with me, not one bit. Uh, but then I was looking into it earlier today, and I saw Rocket Studios said that they had their own in-house studio with a sound stage. And I'm like, well,
no.
that's kind of interesting. What does that really mean, though? We could be talking about a very limited sort of enterprise. You think about,
Yeah,
Quality Studios
Quality Studios is what
they
comes to mind. Is
they had
this
a
place
sound
that's
stage. Yeah, they had a sound stage also. What does that really mean, right?
Quality Studios is an extremely unimpressive place when you look at it. I mean, it is this, and that was that on Santa Monica as well? I mean,
Oh God, I think so. I mean, I'd have to
because
look.
I think on one of your articles you ended with the Sheryl Crow song about all I
Yeah, yeah,
want to do is
yeah,
have
yeah,
some
yeah.
fun
You're right. You're
until the
right.
sun comes up over
I
Santa
think
Monica Boulevard.
I think Hal Guthu's place was on Santa Monica.
Maybe it was Hal's place that was
Yeah,
on Santa Monica. Um, every once in a while in this book, by the way, if you want to, there's street directions and stuff in it. He talks
yeah,
about Santa Monica, he talks about Western Avenue and
yep.
different neighborhoods. So there's a little bit of Los Angeles geography. I always took it that Lazar Studio was one of these great old Hollywood studios that maybe this facility went back to the days of Max Sennett and Charlie Chaplin and things like that. And to make um, nowadays it's being used to make government training films. But it's one of these great old places, you know. And Charlie Brott came with the property or something, like he's just always has been there. Um, but that's what I thought of that place. Was I always pictured it, because when you're reading a novel, you do have to picture the locales in your mind. And I was picturing this place as like one of those old Hollywood studios that still happen to exist, where the buildings still happen to exist into the 1960s, but its glory days were past it. Like it had been this big
Right,
place in like the 20s and 30s and stuff. And now it's not what it was, but is still being used for government training films. I thought maybe that property had come down a little bit, and that Joe Lazar had probably come down a little
right,
bit because
sure. And
Ch- and
Charlie
Charlie
Brott.
Brott had come down in the world a little bit. Um, that's what I thought of it, was as a little bit of faded old Hollywood glory. And
That's good.
maybe I'm romanticizing, but I see those old documentaries, and I have some idea of what those old studio buildings look like. And that's how I always pictured. That's how I always pictured the Lazar Studios in this novel. So it just seemed like, yeah, like an old timey studio.
Yeah, as unlikely as it may seem for a little government-sponsored training facility.
Well, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
a G2, you got to have a G2 clearance to even get in there.
I'd never heard of G2 until I read this book, and then uh, now G2, there was a whole thing about it. G2 is like military intelligence. Is that what G2 is?
G2
Because
is defense clearance clearance for defense personnel. So it could be almost anybody who's working for a government contractor.
well, I've heard that there's G1. G2 is military intelligence. Okay, it's in the Army. It's an Army thing. Uh, G1 is personnel, G3 operations, G4 logistics, and G5 is civil military operations. Again, I've never been in the military in any capacity,
Me either.
and I am completely out of my depth when it comes to talking about this stuff. So you sent me like documents related to G2 clearance, and I'll be darned if I could make head or tail of them.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, I got from G2 was that these are people who are, I'm not making this up, by the way. DISCO, Defense Industrial Security Clearance Office. They get the clearance from DISCO, Defense Industrial Security Clearance Office. So again, these are people who are working mainly for government contractors, is what I take as G2. But yeah, it's all murky, right?
Yeah. So I, Ed knows that one
Right.
bit of lingo. He knows that one bit of jargon. So this book didn't strike me as being overly authentic. No, it didn't strike me as something that an insider would have necessarily written. But that's good,
Yeah.
because had it been too inside baseball, it might have been kind of unreadable at that point. So I'm kind of glad that it is not more. It's Ed keeps this nice comfortably in the realm of fantasy.
It's a pulp novel at the end of the day with a little
Yeah,
smattering of his own obsessions and sex. It doesn't have a whole ton of textual signatures that scream at you like it's Ed. He is, I think, to your point earlier, Joe, I think he's writing out of a fairly sober place for a change for the
right.
most part. There's a lot of narrative incident that the violence and the sort of sudden shocks of violence come fast and furious actually throughout.
Yeah, that's why this is a novel that I would recommend to people who are newer to Ed's
Yeah.
novels. This is one that, if you want to get your feet wet in the um, Ed Wood literary canon, again, my recommendation always, always, always is start with the short stories. Start with Blood Splatters Quickly and Angora Fever.
Yeah.
Say, read one or both of those. You'll get a real feel for how he writes. But I wrote some. I wrote down some lines. These are some of my favorite quotes that you get from this book.
Cool.
You and your files, you and your body, you and your sex implement, you and your smooth ways, you and your goddamn sex appeal. That's another one. Um, Moses and all the Jews, the communists. That's one. Um, some doll got herself bumped off. I like that. And in the story of Jenny Carty, the poor Indiana girl who is, this is where you get Ed's fetishes and obsessions coming in. For no reason, and it has no bearing on the plot whatsoever, we get a flashback to Jenny Carty's past. Jenny Carty exists for like half a chapter. She's like killed before her one chapter is even over. But we get a flashback to her experience with a quote unquote bull dyke who is into S&M. We get this bull dyke relationship between Jenny Carty and a bull dyke. And I was like, that was not necessary to the book at all. But why is it in it here? It's because Ed would put it in. Here's another one. Tim says, to die is an expensive business, even more so when one dies like that. And I was like, Ed, that's Ed's writing. Well, okay, this is one issue that struck me about the book. That all your authority figures here, all your military and cops and Ed's usual heroes, the thing that they hate so much in this book is the very idea of due process and constitutional rights.
Oh yeah.
These scumbags are hiding behind the Bill of Rights, and Eddie probably vomited when they passed the Miranda law, having to read people their rights, because Eddie's view of things is, you just gun them right down there in the streets. That's your question.
It's portrayed. I'm so glad you went there, Joe, because it's portrayed as literally the courts are almost in favor of the criminals, right? They give them
Right.
such a free pass,
And so that's the kind of world Eddie wants, is that there's no due process at all. Like, all this nonsense, arresting them and reading them their rights and trials and lawyers. Oh, it's ridiculous. Why can't we just gun them all down?
Right.
Um, because we believe in America so much. We're such patriots that we hate the Constitution. We're such patriots that we hate the Bill of Rights. Uh, so, these are Eddie's. Oh yeah. Oh, this is another line. An adult actually says this to another adult. I forgot whom. Killed? You mean like in Bang Bang? And I was like, that's that's prime Eddie. But you see, here with a book like Security Risk, Eddie can say this kind of stuff, and it doesn't derail the whole book. It doesn't mean like you get
Yeah.
totally lost in flashbacks. You don't get totally lost in ridiculous lines. Um, I would say the pacing in this book is excellent
Hmm.
because there is tons of action, tons of violence, not a ton of sex, but enough. Um, Eddie again is focused on breasts. He doesn't describe male genitalia too much beyond just manhood. He'll just say manhood. He doesn't get. And as for female genitalia, he doesn't really talk about that much at all. So in a lot of the adult novels, it's going to get explicit in a way that a lot of readers are not going to be comfortable with. It's going to get really
Right.
dirty, and even in some of his film scripts, he gets dirtier than I think people would want him to get. I'm fine with it. I'm numb to it. It just bounces off me at this point. But I know you mentioned the Facebook forum that we are a part of. There are a lot of people who are more genteel Ed fans, and they don't
Yeah.
like to wade too far into the muck.
Right.
And so, even with the Apostolov films, there's cleaner ones and there's dirtier ones, and like Dropout Wife gets pretty nasty. Dropout Wife gets pretty dirty, and I would say if you don't like the dirty talk and really sexually explicit stuff, maybe stay away from that one. Um, Head over to Fugitive Girls or something. Head over in that direction.
Yeah.
Uh, Closer up to the surface of the water here. We're not getting deep under the water here. And this doesn't go too far under the water. Basically, we're not getting too deep into the muck here.
You're right.
It
The muck, Joe, from a lot of people's perspective, I think um, it's a bridge too far for a lot of Ed Wood
Yeah.
fans, is when he's in the Pendulum and Calga mags, the all male mags, where that literally it's a bridge too far. Many people who I've corresponded with and talked about this stuff, real serious Ed Wood researchers, like, I don't want to go there. I don't want to go there.
And I don't know that there's been stories and stuff where I'm a little queasy about them. Um, and but I'm usually able to handle it. I don't really like all the rape stuff that he will put into books and stories, but um, that was a part of the male power fantasy
Yeah,
for a lot of people. So
yeah,
um, I think that there is a huge difference between Ed Wood in 1967 and Ed Wood in 1977. I think by the time, if
you're
you were
right.
getting a decade later, um, if you were to try, I don't know that he by that point could write something of nature. Um, I I guess I've been a little squeamish about getting into his really later fiction because
Okay.
I've heard that stuff is pretty scuzzy. Um,
Well, sure. I mean, by that point, he's largely writing for Swedish erotica film mags, and it's one. It's a whole different world than 1967. To your point, you have to be so much more graphic, and the language. It's it's pornographic. Security Risk, we would, I think, agree, is not
yeah, it's
pornographic,
no,
right?
no, it's
Not
not
even
even
remotely,
close.
right?
It's uh, you know uh, he could he could still clean this up and make a film script out of it.
Yeah,
He would have to he'd have to change the thing that he'd have to change the thing that the natural blonde joke. I think you would probably have to get rid of that. But tonally, of the movies that Ed was involved in the 60s, the one that this reminded me most of was For Love and Money, or For Love or Money. I forget if it's For Love or Money,
Yeah.
because he had a story called For Love and Money and a movie called For Love or Money. I think it's and. The Don Davis wrote. This was the one
Yeah.
about, you know, it's tonally, it's a lot like that. And For Love and Money is a pretty genteel film. If you can navigate that one, you can navigate this. So that's why that's why I wanted to jump into it. I think eventually, I don't know. I think eventually we'll have to just dive in and cover like something
Well,
super sketchy. It's just
we will. We will.
super
So
dirty.
we've been at this obviously for a long time. So it's probably a good point to actually try to start wrapping this up and
Yeah.
say a couple of things. Yeah, what should we do next, right? So here's what I want to propose to everybody. If you, not a whole ton of people watch the Ed Wood Summit podcast, but if you
Hi,
do,
if you're still there,
yeah,
hi.
drop it in the comments. What book would you like to see us review next? Any
Yeah.
anything goes, anything goes. Because to your point, Joe, we've got very sort of genteel books from the mid late 1960s, and we've got very graphic literature from the mid
Yeah.
latter part of the 1970s, and we've got lots of other things that we can talk about here at the Ed Wood Summit podcast, and we will. And
Yeah.
is there anything you want to say in closing, Joe? Am I wrapping this up too quickly? I just
No,
feel
no,
like
it's no, that's a very good way to wrap it up. I would say that Security Risk is an entertaining and fun novel. If you can make it through that first chapter, which is kind of the harshest material in the book, um, I think you're really going to enjoy it. If you are into 60s Bond films and novels, the Ian Fleming novels, I think you'll have a good time with this book. This is really something that I enjoyed reading. So uh, some of the stuff that Ed puts out, I leave it a little depressed. And then this didn't have that effect on me at all. This was a lot of fun for me. So I was glad this one was the novel that we picked, and I'm glad the novel is the way it is. So
beautiful. I agree. I agree. I enjoyed it immensely. I had read it years ago, but at that point in my woodology, I didn't process it in any way near the same way that I did, 5 years on. I know things differently, or I know a lot more, perhaps, maybe not. Maybe I'm flattering myself. But most importantly, I'm really glad you joined me here today, Joe. This has been a tremendous amount of fun. I knew this book was going to really get us into all kinds of
it
different
always
directions.
does.
I knew we were going to have a really hard time following sort of the
Yeah.
narrative. Following the narrative is not an easy thing to do in woodology generally, and or given any one of his paperbacks. We'll be back to do it again. You guys suggest to us what you think might be a cool book for us to jump on, and we'll consider it and maybe even likely do it eventually. So thank you all again for joining me here with Joe at the Ed Wood Summit podcast. We'll be back again in the near future, and always, as always, continue looking for more material at Ed Wood Wednesdays at Joe's Dead Rights blog. Thank you all.